Good morning. Hello, everybody. Warm welcome to this seminar. I see that most of you have somehow escaped the rain, most of you at least. So are universities making the world worse? Today and for the next hour, we will try to unpick that question a bit more and try and explore the role of universities under the shadow of climate change, but also in relation to other social issues. So the plan for today is to have a short presentation, right, Kevin? And then followed by a panel discussion and more questions from the audience. So feel free to participate as well. So my name is Jesse Schaik. I work as a project coordinator at the Center for Environment and Development Studies, CEMUS. It's a center at Uppsala University and the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. But now, so to start with, warm welcome to Kevin Anderson. Kevin, you're a professor of energy and climate change at the University of Manchester. And also for the last year, you've been guest or visiting Zennström professor at Uppsala University. So warm welcome, and we look forward to this.
All right, thanks very much, Jesse. Is this working? Can you hear me okay? Yep, good. All right, I've got a short presentation here which sort of frames the climate change agenda as I see it, and then tries to touch on what our role is as academics. So I'm particularly focusing here on universities. So are universities part of the problem or part of the solution when it comes to climate change? So this is something hopefully you're all familiar with, the Paris Agreement. And I think in a sense this sets the challenge for universities about what we have to do academically. And I'm going to particularly focus here on the mitigation agenda, which is the one I focus on in my research on reducing emissions. And here, the Paris Agreement lays out very clearly what it is that we need to be investigating as academics, about holding the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees centigrade, and actually really trying to focus on 1.5 if we can, to do so in relation to the best science, which I would argue is probably the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but also to take account of equity issues. And these are all enshrined, this is from the Paris Agreement, these are all sort of detailed to some levels within the 32 pages of the Paris Agreement. Well below 2 degrees C, 1.5, best science and equity. And I think if we have those as academics, we can start to sketch out what it is we need to be trying to do. My provocation is in developing 2 degrees C emission scenarios and thinking about climate change in relation to Paris as academics, we have typically fine-tuned our analysis to fit with political and economic sensibilities. So academics are not being what I would say are robust academics many times. They're actually adjusting their analysis to fit with what the politicians and what the economists want to hear. I think universities have been co-opted. No, I'm not saying completely, but have been co-opted by short-term power. And I think I would also say that about the NGOs as well when it comes to climate change. And we typically fear questioning the neoliberal model, the social economic sort of paradigm in which we live. So whatever research we do has to fit in with that view of the world, which I think is a real mistake as academics. That's my provocation. But is this any wonder? Now, this is taken from the UK research councils, and I understand it is different from Sweden. But if it is different in Sweden, then I think it's something to be cautious about. This is the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. These are the people that fund the research in the UK, the engineering research. And notice this: leading universities become centres of innovation, entrepreneurship, generating commercial success to fuel growth. This is the Economic and Social Research Council, the Social Science Research Council. Headline priority: economic performance and sustainable growth. Strategic plan focuses on how to create and achieve sustainable economic growth. You go to the Natural and Environmental Research Council, who do fund things on fish and grass and ants and things that you thought were well away from the economy. And again, their research helps meet the UK's innovation needs and supports economic growth. And their strategic plan is actually called the business of the environment. Horizon 2020, again, a means to drive economic growth. So all the research funders from the UK perspective are all obsessed by economic growth. And if our research doesn't fit into that agenda, it is hard to get funding for. I would say if you had a university report card, this is my take of the UK, and the subject was climate change, our ability is A+, but our attainment in the academic world is D-. And the sort of comments I would put for us as if we were a student in a school looking at these issues is that we are surprisingly bright with ability, which is what you would hope about universities, but we are easily distracted and we are obsequious when faced with hierarchy. We don't like to counter the hierarchical structures of our universities and what other people say. We demonstrate no leadership or integrity, typically in universities. We have real potential, but we have chosen to squander it. And that's what I would say within the UK in relation to climate change. It would be interesting to what you think the report card would look like for Swedish universities in relation to the Paris challenge. Now, and the backdrop to Paris is that the mitigation message hasn't changed in the last 27 years. The first IPCC report came out in 1990, 27 years ago. That is probably as long ago as some of you were children then, and some of you may not even been born. So we've known everything we need to know about climate change to respond to the challenge for 27 years. And yet this year, our emissions will be 60% higher than the time of the first report in 1990. So people with no hair or grey hair have failed appallingly on climate change for over a quarter of a century. The other important backdrop, I think, that fed into Paris is that in terms of temperature, what really matters now are carbon budgets, not about some long-term target. It's not about what happens in 2050 or 2030 or 2045 in Sweden. It's what, in terms of these, it's what we think about in terms of carbon budgets. And if you're not familiar with that, I'm just going to show it here graphically. This is our emissions historically. And for a carbon budget, we're worried about the area under the curve. And we're not worried about what happens over here or here. We're worried about the total area under the curve. And if we delay mitigation today, we don't do so much today, then we have to compensate for that in the future if we can, because that will mean much higher reduction rates. So that's the carbon budget framework. That is the scientific foundation that we need to build climate change laws on. So how are we doing on this? Well, this is our historical emissions here. And before Paris, we were heading towards 4 to 6 degrees C of warming, which is just a catastrophic planet. It's nothing like the place that we would recognize. But with the Paris pledges, if you add them all together from every country around the globe, it still comes out to about 3 to 4 degrees C of warming, which is still a dramatic change from where we are now. And yet what we said in Paris is that we promised the poor parts of the world and our own children that we would hold the temperature below 2 degrees centigrade. But just look at that. That means zero carbon energy and virtually all other industrial processes by about 2050. Zero carbon. We also said within the Paris Agreement that we would take account of equity. So the Paris Agreement demands that wealthy parts of the world, like the UK, the EU, the US, and Sweden, and so forth, that we make reductions much more rapidly than this. The headline message for Sweden from the work that Jesse, myself, and other colleagues at CEMUS have been doing, say that if Sweden is to meet its Paris commitment, which presumably it would like to, or at least it would pretend it would like to do, and it wants to have a scientific foundation rather than one based on astrology, so presumably it would want to have that as well, then it needs to reduce its emissions starting now, in fact starting at the beginning of this year, at 12% every single year, at least 12%. That's a 75% reduction in emissions by 2025, fully decarbonised energy by 2035. And that would be the same roughly for the UK. This is a completely different agenda from the one that we hear, often from academics, even though this is based on all of their sorts of research. This is a hugely politically challenging task ahead of us. So what's the role for universities? Well, universities have provided a huge understanding of the climate change problem, whether it's the climate science, whether it's the impacts, the adaptation, or the mitigation. So now universities have been pivotal in understanding these things. But actually, who have been pivotal? Which people in universities? It's been a really narrow group of people. The people that have engaged have been the scientists, the engineers, and the economists. They're the ones that have dominated the discourse so far on climate change. What we haven't had, and I think this is a real shame, is we haven't had the social sciences deeply involved. We haven't had political science. At least they haven't been feeding in much into the IPCC. They've been kept out of the process. We haven't had the humanities, the philosophy, or the arts. So huge swathes of knowledge and understanding of the world have not really informed the agenda on climate change. And this narrow thinking, I think, has led to a real set of what I would call technocratic scams, offsetting, paying the poor to diet for us, the clean development mechanism, which is just a state-sanctioned form of offsetting, asking Ghana to make reductions rather than making them in the UK. The emissions trading scheme, put that in place, but make sure there's so many permits the price of carbon is almost zero, keeps industry happy. Negative emission technologies. This is the latest scam that we are using to pretend we're going to suck huge quantities of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, hundreds of billions of tons. And if that fails, we've always got geoengineering, putting sulfates into the stratosphere to reflect sunlight back out into space. We have not bothered yet to try mitigation to actually reduce our emissions. So we have spent 25 years with this set of scams. And I think this comes out of a very simplistic scientific, engineering and economic focus without taking on board the social scientists. And I should say that I am actually an engineer. So universities are supposed to be thought leaders, but our thoughts, I would argue, have been dominated by technocratic solutions. We have focused on low carbon energy supply. We haven't really focused on the demand side at all. We're obsessed by price mechanisms, whether it's carbon tax and so forth. We aren't using other more innovative ways of thinking about these issues. And we are now focused on negative emission technologies because the challenge looks so difficult, and we're not prepared to question the economy. There's no real discussion of high carbon lifestyles. There's no discussion of rationing or social engineering, things that we may have to think about, of all the suites of ways that social scientists and humanities and philosophy, these other ways of thinking about these challenges may offer us whole sets of insights that are now just separate from this debate. They're not included. But the question it needs to be asked, actually, if they have got insights, is there anything we can do from that direction? Is there enough scope to reduce our emissions away from just the technologies? Well, I think there is, and I'm going to touch on one thing here, which I think as academics we should be thinking about more seriously, but does require us to engage much more with the social scientists. There's a huge asymmetry, imbalance, in terms of our carbon dioxide emissions, and indeed in our energy consumption. 50% of global carbon dioxide emissions come from just 10% of the population. And what I think is quite striking here is if that 10% reduce their emissions to the level of the average European citizen, so if they reduce their carbon footprint to that of the average European, not really very low, that would be a 1/3 cut in global emissions. So just 10% reducing to the average European level would be a 1/3 cut. Compare that with the Paris pledges, which see almost no reduction even by 2030. So I think that just shows there is huge potential if you start to move outside of just simple technical solutions. But who is in that 10%? Why are we not even thinking about these things? Why are they not being discussed? Well, partly because we might recognize them. Climate scientists, they're in that group. Universities, pretty much everyone in university is in that group. And if there are students that aren't quite there, they're trying to, they're at university to get a better job, get paid more money, so they can join this group very quickly. So we're all party to this. Those of us that fly frequently, we may recycle our things at home, but we're flying around the world and we are part of that 10% group. And generally audiences for any event on climate change are also part of that 10% group. So we know who they are. We know what they look like. They look like us. And this hasn't worked. Put simply, academics flying around the world to exotic venues like Rio or Paris or Cancun or Bali for big climate change jamborees, and telling the little people beneath their planes they've got to reduce their emissions. Surprisingly, that hasn't worked. We have not demonstrated leadership ourselves. This is what we do as academics all the time. In 2017, climate change is system change. If we started in 1990, we could have solved it by the usual sets of economic and technical measures. But we now have almost no carbon budget left. We have chosen to squander it. So it is now system change if we are serious about protecting the future in any way from very severe levels of climate change. What does this mean for universities? Well, it begs, the logic of carbon budget begs fundamental questions about our norms and our paradigms, and this does include for universities, but I'm just focusing on those here. If we're a university, we need to be thinking about how do we cut our emissions at 12% every year. And I don't just mean the ones to do with our energy, what we consume in the buildings, but actually academics flying around the world. We like the idea of bringing in international students. That's a really good thing from a cultural perspective, so we argue, though we're mostly doing it for income. So we bring these students in, but that, of course, locks in very high carbon emissions. We need to be thinking about that. 12% every single year. We need to be thought leaders. We shouldn't be afraid to question the status quo. We shouldn't be afraid to question the economic paradigms. We have to remember that it's ideas that matter, not hierarchy. Just because you're a professor doesn't mean you know anything more about climate change or sustainability than necessarily a student does, or even the caretakers. So it's the ideas that matter, not the hierarchy. We have to be independent. We have to fight for that independence from government, from industry, from NGOs. That's our job as academics. We are supposed to be, as near as we can be as humans, objective, neutral analysts of the issues at hand. And obviously we're humans, so that's not always the case. But we should fight for independence. We should ignore political and economic sensibilities. It doesn't matter whether people like or dislike our conclusions. That is irrelevant. It's whether they agree or disagree. That's what matters. So we're not there to be liked as academics. But we should be courteous. So we should engage in a courteous fashion. Not always easy to do, I think. We should communicate clearly. We should not sweeten the pill, which academics are doing all the time in this, and some of the most well-known climate change academics do that. They say, we can't tell the public this. We can't be honest about this. Then they will sweeten the pill to make it look a bit more attractive. That's exactly what negative emission technologies do all the time. We need to be vociferous when other people misuse our research, when other people, whether it's academics or policymakers, if they're using our research to support their position and they're misusing the research, we need to point that out loudly. We should foster an environment of interdisciplinary thinking. We have system-level issues now that require us to start to work together across the silos within universities. So we need to be fostering that. We talk about it rhetorically, but we don't really do that in real depth yet. And I think we need to lead by example. And there's some really good academic research that shows the credibility of our research is improved if we as academics start to live as if we believed our own research, which at the moment, clearly we don't. I'm going to finish off, as a quick whip through this, with a message from the Pope, which is actually the start of the talk I'm giving tomorrow morning, I think at the same venue, isn't it? Yeah. So I'm using this one tomorrow to sort of frame the debate. This is from his encyclical. The alliance of technology and economics ends up sidelining anything unrelated to its immediate interests. Consequently, the most that one can expect is superficial rhetoric, sporadic acts of philanthropy, and perfunctory expressions of concern for the environment, whereas any genuine attempt to introduce change is viewed as a nuisance based on romantic illusions. And actually, that's, I think, where we need to be focusing. We need to focus on these romantic illusions. It's in there that the real solutions reside. And just because other people refer to them like that as romantic illusions doesn't mean to say that there isn't something valid in there. We have tried the alliance of technology and economics, and nothing so far has worked at any scale. So we need to be thinking differently. So I think the Pope has captured this wonderfully. And actually, the encyclical is one of the best climate change documents available. I hasten to add, I'm not a Catholic. But, so on that note, thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Kevin. And with this, I would like to invite the panel to the floor to continue the discussion. And while you get set up, I actually would like to read a quote by an environmental educator, David Orr, that some of you might have read about or seen. He writes from an American perspective, and I thought this quote could start the framing for this discussion. So if today is a typical day on planet Earth, we will lose 116 square miles of rainforest, or about an acre a second. We will lose another 70 square miles to encroaching deserts as a result of human mismanagement and overpopulation. We will lose 40 to 100 species, and no one knows whether the number is 40 or 100. Today, the human population will increase by 250,000, and today we will add 2.7 tons of chlorofluorocarbons to the atmosphere and 15 million tons of carbon. Tonight, the Earth will be a little hotter, the water a bit more acidic, and the fabric of life threadbare. So what is the role of education and research in relation to this will be the start of the discussion. And I actually would like to start with a bit of a provocative question to the panel. So are actually universities making the world worse? Are they educating students to destroy the world?
Okay, I'll start. My name is Josefin Wangel, and I work as an associate professor in sustainable urban development at KTH, Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. So most of the students I meet are engaged in a master's program focusing on sustainable urban development. And I can see that already when I meet these students, when I meet them, they already have a bachelor in architecture or planning or engineering or so. And they have already started to doubt whether they can make any change to society at large. And I share their concern because I can see that the role of universities, the role of academia, and the role of the knowledge that we produce and manage isn't taken up in society as it should be. So what I try to focus on during the 2 years that I have the privilege to work with these students is to equip them for the reality they will be facing when they enter work life, and to try to get the hopes up a bit, but also to help them to become more strategic in terms of daring to be provocative, daring to question hierarchy, and daring to reformulate and represent problems in different ways than we are used to seeing them today. But with that said, I think that as if you would do a climate budget, a climate account on your universities, of course it would be much better for the climate if the universities and the people inhabiting the universities weren't there. That's the basic fact.
I can say something too. My name is Johanna Dernfalk, and I work at the Research Council Formas. So I guess I'm kind of representing the government in this area. It's very interesting to listen to both of you. I can agree on some things you say and also with you. But I think with we are representing the politics, and the politics is not always logical or like depending on the scientific knowledge. But I think to a higher degree it actually is, and I think we're moving towards. I think we're moving in the right direction. I mean, we have a lot, like you already said. I mean, we know a lot, but I think also the government is starting to try to formate the future in the right direction now with the academia.
Would you like to add something, Kevin?
I just wonder I think the big problem for climate change is an issue of time, and we don't have a lot of time to play with. And at the moment, I don't think universities have been particularly good at that. They sort of they just look at solutions almost in isolation, without thinking about how do they get implemented, how fast can they be implemented, what does that mean for wider society. And that's really why I think a lot of the other disciplines need to be brought into these agendas. But I think almost we have a problem, I think, almost from when we're children, in that as parents, we sort of say to our children as they keep asking why, we try to sort of push them away. They're difficult questions to answer and we haven't got the time. You then get to school and they start to get molded in a particular direction. The inquisitive mind of the child is partly in a school, is closed down. You then get to universities and you have these sets of disciplines, and you have to learn set ways of thinking about issues. So I think as we go through our lives, almost the inquisitiveness that we have when we're really young is not fostered, is not encouraged. It's gradually molded and closed down to think of the world in the way that we see the world today. That's not deliberate. No one's doing that deliberately. It's just an outcome of the system. But I just do think that actually that sort of system is why why we can't address these issues today, because we're not encouraged to be more innovative in our ways of thinking, to think outside of the box. We are encouraged to think within the box, within the frames of our society.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Josefin, please.
Yeah, and I think related to that, the question, are universities making the world worse, kind of implies another question. Should universities be making the world better? And if that would be the case, how do we define better? And I bring this up because a lot of academia, as we know it today, have its roots in the Enlightenment process and the idea of progress that comes from modernity. And I think that as long as we equate better with progress, with economic growth, I think that we can't crack this nut of climate change mitigation. So it's not only a matter of learning to embrace complexity and to think unsiloed or undisciplined, as John Robinson frames it. It's also a matter of thinking beyond narrow conceptualizations of progress.
Mm-hmm. If I can have a follow-up question, some of you already approached this a bit, but looking at the university through their operations, but also their teaching and learning practices, how could they address the climate change challenge if we were to rethink the way they work, the way they function, and the way they do education and research?
Well, my first comment, and it relates to a lot of the work that I've done with my other colleagues, is to think about aviation. Aviation is emblematic of a high carbon society, and every group, whether it's a company or whether it's universities or whether it's NGOs, they all argue we have no alternative. We have to be involved in this international globalized world. Well, if that is the case, we have to find ways out of necessarily physically traveling around the world all of the time. So for universities, aviation is a very large part of their carbon footprint. When we think about it from a research level, we have academics going away on field trips or on conferences. A lot of conferences, I think we could just stop. I mean, many of the conferences are just rubbish. Academics are going to visit people they know really well to hear talks they've heard many times before that are available on the web, and they can read the papers on the social media anyway. So a lot of conferences are not needed. There are interactions there that are useful, but nowhere near as many as we go to. When it comes to field work, I think that's more problematic. But in terms of field work, often I think we need to think, how do we do it differently? It will mean changes to our lives. It will mean rather than going 3 times a year to do a month in our field work, maybe going away for a year. That would be difficult, but it's not as difficult as expecting people in Bangladesh to deal with the impacts of climate change. So we will have to make fundamental changes to how we actually operate our research. When it comes to teaching, I think it's very good having international students in Sweden or Swedish students elsewhere, but that does come with a huge carbon legacy. They fly here usually often fly at least once a year. They may go home 2 or 3 times during the year. They may develop relationships between a Ghanaian and a Swedish person, or a Swedish person and a Scottish person, which means that they lock in then these relationships and lots of physical travel, which usually means aviation. We can't ignore these issues. I don't know how you resolve them, but we have to start to think more carefully about what we're doing in universities. So I think aviation is an emblematic issue. It describes why it is, or outlines why it is we are struggling within universities. And if we can solve that one, we will probably help us understand some of the other issues that occur within universities.
I think it's really nice to listen to you. I don't know, but Formas had, in the last innovation bill, or research and innovation bill in November, Formas got a new mission to start a long-term climate program in research. It's a 10-year program, and this is supposed to, there were 6 different national research programs in this bill, and one of them is on climate, and Formas is responsible for this one. And it's going to be, I think from this year it starts with 25 million, well, there's always money involved in this, although Formas has a mission to encourage the sustainable development of the society, but it's economic, ecological, and societal, all the perspectives are in this. Anyway, this should be a long-term 10-year program, and it's going to go, I think, for 130 million Swedish crowns per year, so it's quite a lot of research money in this program. And it's going to build on a common national strategic agenda. And this agenda, we should make a long-term agenda for it. And this one is we're supposed to do this together with the people interested in this area. So it's going to be both research councils, it's going to be universities, researchers, other actors. So it's going to be really multidisciplinary. And there it's very important to try to think in these new ways. How should this really be? What is needed to actually make steps forward in this area and to make solutions instead of just continuing to build up, knowledge. We have to do some, so this is very good to listen to you. And also we are going to need to have these dialogues about the aviation, or, we always talk about mobility is very good. We have to have a global perspectives and international, everything, but, what's the backside? And it's it's good. But Formas is we just started with this national program. We have, right now we have a call open where we also try to start with, we ask for researchers to do what we call synthesis, or you have to synthesize a bit what's happening, what's going on in this area. And we also encourage arts, and I mean, we encourage not only the natural sciences and engineering, but all different aspects to come in with your ideas on, or try to describe what's going on.
Yes, a couple of years ago, KTH ended up as the worst performing university in Sweden when it came to environmental impact. It was the Swedish EPA, Naturvårdsverket, who did this analysis. And as a result, well, this was not only the reason, but this was used by the KTH Vice Rector for Sustainability as a leverage point to get the entire university to start implementing an ISO environmental management system. And I know it is surprising that KTH didn't have an ISO certification before this. But this process resulted in that KTH had to start define what are the main environmental impacts of KTH, both negative and positive. And in this, of course, aviation came up, or travel came up as one of the key direct impacts, negative ones, of the university. And KTH has ever since struggled to implement a travel policy that would kind of allow researchers to continue doing what researchers do, while still keeping the impact of that down. I think Uppsala University has a much more progressive climate policy, which I've forwarded to our vice rector. So hopefully we will see some changes there soon. But another part of the impact of universities that it's much more hard to capture and impossible to quantify is the impact universities has on society in terms of discourse, in terms of thoughts, in terms of what can or cannot be said or thought or practiced. And so Kevin's point that we as researchers, we have to live according to the science we do is one very, very important part of this, especially since it impacts our possibilities to make academic careers. And I think that this is the crux. So for me, I haven't stopped flying completely, but I'm very reluctant to fly. And for me, this have led to a whole new research practice. And I can see that for many people, it's not the concern about climate change that is provocative. It is the fact that I let this concern influence my research practice. That is provocative to people, because I waste time when I go to conferences by train instead of flying. And I think this is the real challenge for academia and for society at large, to kind of reformulate how we see careers and how we balance different values in society and in our personal lives as well.
Thank you. I want to bounce back to what Johanna mentioned earlier, the role of research councils. So looking at universities in a bigger landscape, amongst research councils and other academic bodies, how could those connections be strengthened or improved in order to address climate change and other social issues? How can those elements be tightened together?
I guess dialogue is a nice way to start. Like, I mean, the government has the politics is one thing, and I mean it's the climate and the climate change and everything is very on top level of the politics right now. So everybody's talking about it and how can we solve it. And like you said, Horizon 2020 is more into they have the societal challenges. I think Formas, we have the mission to fund both basic science, but also like innovation, close science, but our main mission is to work towards the sustainable development of society. I mean, we always have this impact. The research we fund should always be of impact for or relevant to the society. And for being able to do that, we have to have a dialogue to see what's going on outside. I mean, we can't only just spread the money and don't follow it. It has to make use somewhere. And I guess in the first way is the communication and the dialogue. And I think communication is an important, both as a research funder, like communicating what we what the plan is for the money, or what the goal is. I mean, and then also what is actually happening with it. What is the results of the research, and how is it used in the outside the academia? I guess that's one way, at least.
Any other comments?
Yes, of course. So I would, if I could make a wish list to Formas and other research councils, that wish list would have only two, but two quite big points in it. And the first would be, already today, when we as researchers apply for funding, we have to write down if there are any ethical concerns, like if we have interviewees and how we would deal with the interviewees, etc. We have to reflect on gender issues in the constellation of the research group, for instance. We have to make sure that our research is published open access at least 6 months from its being published, etc. And I think maybe the fourth or another part of that could be like climate impact or environmental impact, asking researchers to account for how this research project would impact the environment in the doing of the research. I think that would be a clear sign, a clear message to researchers that it's also the practice of research that is important. And the second point would be this, the concept of impact. So Formas is one of the research councils that puts the most attention to societal relevance, which I think is great. But there is a shift in Sweden, as in many other countries today, to interpret societal relevance. I'm not saying that Formas is doing this. I'm just a bit concerned that maybe you will start doing this. But there is a tendency of interpreting or defining societal relevance in terms of quantifiable impact. And I think that this impact concept is important, but also super, super difficult. Because if we want to engage the humanities, if we want to engage qualitative social sciences, if we want to ask new questions and reformulate problems, then we can't also have the demand to quantify the impact in terms of numbers of saved kilowatt hours, or as the Swedish Energy Agency demands you to do when you apply for funding from them.
A cautionary note from the UK. So we were discussing this briefly yesterday. So I think Sweden, fortunately, has not gone nowhere near as far as the UK yet. But the research councils in the UK always had a very clear sort of arm's length distance between government and the research councils. So they would fund research that they thought was appropriate, even though, of course, it was government money. And there was a very clear distinction between the two. And the research councils fought their ground very firmly that they would not be influenced by short-term sort of policy decisions. That has changed. That has changed very significantly in the UK. So there is just often, to say, a thin cigarette paper between the, if you were a smoker, which I'm not, but anyway, between the research councils and government. And I think that is very dangerous. So my cautionary note would be that to ensure that within Sweden you maintain what I understand at the moment is still quite an arm's length distance between the research councils and the requirements in the sort of relatively short term of policymakers. That's important. And I think I've really sort of echo all your points. I would like to see some sort of carbon accounting associated with research budgets. We have to put an account in for the amount of money that we have to explain how we're going to spend the money that we get when we apply for research funding. I think it would be interesting to sort of say, well, you know, and what do you anticipate the carbon implications being? And you may well have to put in there then that we need to do this sort of work here, but we are thinking about how we can travel there. So we have to put that in, as we have to do with a budgetary plan. So it would be a carbon budgetary plan. So I think we could be doing that. And I also am very cautious about, although I like quantification for some things, other times I think qualitative measures are really important. So even though as an engineer I like the numbers, I think when it comes to things like impact, it's very hard to, I think almost impossible to find a quantitative measure to assess impact. At the same time, we do need to think about those sorts of sets of issues. But of course, basic research is really important. You know, Einstein wouldn't be able to do the work he was doing if he had to fill in the impact statement and said, I'm going to get this output. So if you look through history, it's a wash with wonderful basic research that much later sometimes comes out to show some benefit. So we have to also be cautious about only moving research towards things where we can think we can see a tangible impact in the short term.
But this is fun. We had impact cases where we actually asked the universities to give us like stories about how the impact has been. And it was really nice to see that, like you said, basic science in the 70s kind of evolved and developed. And now, like 35 years later, you can see, oh, but this what's happened. I mean, but you could never have, in the 80s, you would have no idea.
Yeah.
But that's also what we always have to try to have this long-term perspective. We know that in the political atmosphere, then you have to have short-term, you have to have some decision, you have to show some result. And of course, some research can do that, but most research is a very slow process. I mean, and that's our ambition to really try to have this long-term perspective.
Thank you. Being aware of time here, there's still a few questions that I would like to address, but I think I first want to give the opportunity to the public and to the audience to ask a few questions to the panelists. So is there already a few questions? I'm just going to come over with the microphone.
Yes, my name is Martin. I work here at the university for an organization called Swedest, who are concerned with these kind of issues, sustainability and learning, those kind of things. So I really appreciate your talk. I think I appreciate that you call for social scientists to get involved into the climate change issues. I think that's very important. And I think that you, with your talk here, have demonstrated some of the things that social scientists can do, namely to critique the small things that we do in our mundane everyday practices, as you have done with your own practices, research practices. What kind of things are we doing that we take for granted, and what is normalized behavior in different kinds of practices? But I would also like to say that we need to not only scrutinize our own practices, but also help with scrutinizing other practices, because as academics we have the luxury of having the time to be critical, and we are trained to be critical, and we are trained to help people to reflect on things. And for doing that, I think that one thing that we need to do is to get quite close to the practices outside of universities to understand what's taking place in the industry, what is enabling this kind of things that we feel can question, and things that are taken for granted for normalizing and sending us off to the abyss eventually. So we need to do that both within the industry and within the public sector and civil society, and we need to be close. But then the challenge for a researcher, in my view, is to be close enough to understand, to be critical according to the practices in a particular setting in society, but also have a distance to be able to be critical. And that's, I think, that the distance and the closeness, that's the challenge, I think.
Thank you, Martin. Are there any questions from the public? Other questions? Otherwise, because I would like to bounce back to what you started to approach here, and also to what was mentioned earlier. There is academics in that sense have a lot of flexibility in their operation and how they can act. And is there therefore a role by the university in facilitating that outreach to what we call society? Is there ways in which we could actually train academics to be either better communicators or to address some of those issues?
I mean, I think there are many things that we could be doing to improve the communication, but it's not a one-way communication between academics and the non-academic community, or whether it's industrial or civil society. But it's a two-way process. So it's not just, for instance, from a researcher's point of view. I don't think it's what we do our research, and then we can say, well, here's our results, let's communicate them. Actually, often we need to think, well, how would you define the research problem in the first place? And that may well mean that we have to engage with other people. Not always, depends on the research. And I think we have to be quite careful to, we want these links with civil society and with industry, but we also then want to maintain that distance as academics. But I mean, there's some really interesting work that's been done in anthropology, and people like Bruno Latour that have done that, have actually worked in industries for often quite a lot of years, and then gone back into university to talk about their work and their experience within those industries. So I think there are some really good academic examples of how we can try to do this, but they're always quite challenging. But in terms of communication, so as a sort of a scientist who likes PowerPoint presentations, I recognise that's not a great way of communicating for most of the population. So it's not my job, clearly it's not my job, to engage with wider civil society other than through the sorts of means I normally use. But that's why I think the humanities and the arts are also important, because they're naturally much better communicators. Now, they've got something to say about the research landscape as well. But for me personally, who works more on sort of the engineering and the technical side much of the time, and the science side, actually we need some help in how do we get these messages communicated more widely, and then the interactions with wider society. And that's often through narratives, through storylines, not through PowerPoints and numbers and graphs. And I think, therefore, we need to find much better ways to engage. And we are doing that. You see that with some of our colleagues within Uppsala and at CEMUS, but also back in Manchester. I engage a lot with artists. I don't always fully understand what comes out from their side, and I can't always immediately see how that is supposed to communicate it. But I think that's fine. They engage with the public in a very different way to the way that I do. And I think we have to recognise there's real value in that. And they will interpret things in a way that I simply won't understand, and I don't think I should then criticise them for that. I think I just have to engage and then let them have that freedom. The idea is, my ideas and my colleagues' ideas are out there, and they're free for other people to use, manipulate, adjust, as long as not lying about what our outputs are. So I think that relationship between arts, communication and science is really important, and one that we should be fostering more within universities.
Any following remarks?
Yes, I just a bit of caution on how you understand communication, because I think that one of the key problems that we have today regarding climate change mitigation is that we still rely on an understanding of people as rational individuals, rather than social negotiators, always part of different social contexts, and with our own desires and hopes and fears. So I think that in a first step, and this relates very much to why we need to involve humanities and art and artists in climate change mitigation, is because we can't rely on this deficit-based model of understanding people, that if only people knew better, then they would stop flying. Well, I know better, I haven't stopped flying. Or if people only got their attitudes right, then they would stop flying. Well, I think I've got my attitudes very much in line with climate change mitigation, but I still fly. And why do I fly? Why do we fly? Why do we eat meat? Why do we live in ever larger apartments, etc., etc.? And this brings in, again, the issue of complexity of this world at all levels and across different levels. And it also, I think, brings forth an important role for transdisciplinary approaches involving other forms of knowing and knowledge than is traditionally acknowledged in academia. So bodily experiences, practical knowledge, tacit knowledge, all of that can be engaged in climate change mitigation. But that calls for us academics to kind of step out of our offices and engage with the real world, which can be super scary because we are taught that we shouldn't do that in order to remain objective. We should keep at least an arm-length distance to whatever we're studying. Yeah.
Thank you. Any last comments from the audience? There's still a bit of time left, so I really want to open up the floor. Yeah, in the front, Lovisa.
Hi, my name is Louisa. I'm working at Weithz with Martin as a research assistant, but I'm starting my PhD in Uppsala University in the business studies, exploring how business and economic education is implementing sustainability and philosophy into education. And I think this is really interesting what you talked about how you are kind of, as a researcher, of course it's really important to be a good role model and to walk the talk, and like you say, but I think that like I've listened to you a lot now, Kevin, and you put a lot of emphasis on us as academics to walk the talk, and you know how universities on operational levels, you know what role we have there. But within these 10% that you talk about, that are actually the CO2 emissions from the 10% is like 33% of the CO2 emissions. A lot of there are only few actors there that is actually the business decision makers out there, industry, that is causing those CO2 emissions. So we academics, you put so much responsibility on the individual, where we kind of, as academics, I think our role is more, we are educating decision makers that are going to be really powerful. For example, in economic and business studies, managers. And that is what I think is so important to kind of bring philosophy into business, economics, into engineering, all these subjects that we are actually, you know, where they are going to make decisions in the society. And I feel that this connection between understanding what it means to be a professional in connection to society. Do you have any comments on that, or how you feel that is kind of going in the academia to make students that are going to be a decision makers in society understand their role with society and nature?
I'll comment on two things. Firstly, I think I focus on the individual, but not really with a focus on the individual, if that makes sense. I see the individual not as something that's separate, but as part of a system. And in a sense that the individuals that I'm focusing on are people like us. We are the catalysts for system change. You know, just aggregating lots and lots of individual change is not going to get us to where we need to be. Our actual individual emissions, for most of us, maybe if you're Leonardo DiCaprio or someone, but they don't really matter that much. But actually, the system changes that our individual behaviors bring about because other people see them, because they get scaled up in a very messy, complex way. That is what that's why I argue we need to have individuals making changes. And those individuals need to be people who actually are the high emitters and who have wider influence, which we of course do as academics. We have our students, we have our academic colleagues, and also outside of academia, people do still have a lot of respect, even if it's quite grudging in somewhere like the UK, for academia. So I think we are part of a system change I'm trying to drive, and the individual is just one element of that. In terms of the role of engaging with future decision makers and so forth, yeah, that is really important. And I think this comes back to actually very much what CEMUS is trying to do, when it's trying to bring different sets of insights, different sets of knowledges, not just the ones that we have in universities more formally, but also the ones you referred to earlier, and that try to ensure that decision makers have a better grasp of a wider world. And I think one of the problems is that historically we've had business studies courses or, you know, engineering courses or whatever, and they're very, very narrow. And that's appropriate sometimes. But actually, if we want people to go out and start to make very informed strategic decisions, that's probably not right. They need to have a much broader understanding of the world within which those decisions are going to be played out. And that is quite difficult for universities. We've spent 2,000 years very effectively with reductionism. Certainly since post-Enlightenment, it's been incredibly successful. But it doesn't help us solve the system-level issues that we are now starting to have to face because there are 7.5 billion of us consuming lots and having big interactions with the rest of the planet and the rest of the ecosystems on the planet. So universities really are struggling to know how do you do that. After a long period of great success with reductionism, how do you then start to break that down and say we also need systems thinking? And I think somewhere like CEMUS in Uppsala is a really good example that is trying to do that. And it's a challenge. I'm not saying that CEMUS or any of us have the answers, but at least we're moving in the right direction there.
Josefin?
Yes, thank you. So regarding the focus on the individual, I totally agree with Kevin here that it's not about assigning responsibility to the individual as consumer or as citizen, but it's about recognizing the power of the example. So every time I tell myself that I can't pursue an academic career if I can't fly, I'm telling that to the rest of the world as well, to all of my colleagues. and I'm reinforcing the system. But every time I say that, hey, you know what, I heard about this crazy UK guy who stopped flying. And you know what? He went to China by train on a conference presentation, for a conference presentation. And I've decided I won't fly in work for a year, which is absurd in relation to climate change mitigation, I know, but it's still provocative. That makes it possible for my colleagues to think of that as a possibility. So, because I heard of Kevin once, we are now quite a big group of researchers at KTH, that some of us don't fly at all, and some of us fly like once every second year or something. So the power of the example is, I think, what we're aiming at, rather than putting all the responsibility at the individual. And there are some nice theoretical framings of this from social practice theory, from communities of practice theory, from utopian thought. For instance, Frederick Jameson, who's famous for quoting from an unknown source that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end to capitalism. He talks about utopian programs, which is policymaking, changing the overall societal discourse, and utopian practices, which are the micro-practices, or in the word of Ruth Levitas, the interstitial utopias that creates pockets within the contemporary regime for other ways of doing, other ways of being, other ways of understanding what it could mean to be a human being. So when I talk about individuals and that individuals should critically reflect on their own practices, it is from that point of view, and not from a neoliberal understanding of the individual as a relevant unit of analysis.
Thank you. I see that time has run out, so I really want to say thank you to the panel, Josefin and Johanna, and thank you for Kevin for the presentation. Thank you for the audience. CEMUS will be back and occupy this space at the same time tomorrow morning at 9:30. And otherwise, you're more than welcome to come and chat with the panel. I'm sure we have some time now. So thank you again.